Hi everyone, I'm Samantha DeLeon and I'm part of the International ACAC Communications Committee, and I am here today to talk with you about international financial aid. It's the hottest topic that I think I always get at any table. So today with me we actually have a series of panelists, and I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves. John, go ahead.
Good morning, evening, or afternoon. I'm Tracy Grimm, and I am currently a college counselor at Lincoln School in San Jose, Costa Rica. I'm also on the Inclusion, Access, and Success Committee.
Hello, I'm Jenny Howenstein. I work at St. Olaf College. I'm one of the Associate Deans and Director of International Recruitment.
This is Laura Cobb. I'm working at Yale University and the Yale Young African Scholars Program. Until very recently I was working at African Leadership Academy in South Africa. I'm also on the Inclusion, Access, and Success Committee with International ACAC.
Hello, I am John Wilkerson. I direct the Office of International Admissions at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and I also serve on the IAS committee. Thanks for joining us.
Perfect. And I just want to ask a question to our attendees. We want to know, where are you coming from? So I'm going to launch a poll, and hopefully you see that. Hopefully you'll be able to answer that, and we will see where most of you guys are coming from. So I'll give that a couple more seconds. And I will close that poll in 10 seconds, let's say, because the numbers are still changing. And I'm going to share those results because it seems like about 50% are coming from Asia, Oceania, 39% North America. And that's always good to see and hear. And one other question: what is your current role? So I'm going to send this out so our panelists know a little bit about who you are as an attendee. So again, I'll give that another 30 seconds, and then we will start our presentation. We're going to reserve questions for the end, but I will take notes of them. There is a question box that you can go ahead and fill out, and I will go ahead and direct them to the panelists after. So another 9 seconds for this. So thanks again for participating, and let me launch this so you guys can see who's in the room. But it does seem like there are a lot of high school guidance counselors, which is great, some university representatives, and independent consultants. So again, thank you so much. You probably won't be hearing from me for a while. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and I believe might either go to John or Laura first.
Laura.
Laura, got it.
Thanks very much, Sam. So I am pleased to give you some of the introductory comments. So if we can go to the agenda slide, we'll just review quickly what we plan to talk about today. So we want to make sure that everyone's familiar with the terminology, get the vocab, so we'll run through some important terms, talk a little bit about how financial aid or financial need is determined by colleges and universities, and also how much aid is really out there so that we get an understanding of how much is available to students and where to find it. We'll run through the process of applying for financial aid and also talk a little bit about what university sort of really costs to get past that sticker price and look at what the reality is for families and students, and any other questions that may come up. So moving right along, we'll look at the slide that goes through some important terms so that we're all sort of on the same page when we hear these phrases. So foreign student, kind of an old-fashioned phrase at this stage, fortunately. More commonly you'll hear international student, but either way this phrase refers specifically to a student who is not a U.S. citizen, not a U.S. passport holder. So that is someone who would apply for a F1 student visa in the application process. Need-based financial aid is exactly what it sounds like. It is financial aid which is awarded based on a calculation of the student and the family's need, how much money they need to be able to afford the full cost of study. Merit awards are financial aid and or scholarships granted based on the merit or the deservingness, let's say, of the student, as merit awards are earned, for example, for high grades or athletic ability or musical talent, et cetera, et cetera. So those are funds based on earning the financial aid. That is often sort of on the other side of that coin. You see need blind or need aware financial aid. Need blind, I'm going to be a little political here. I think this is actually a misnomer. I would prefer if we all said need ignorant or need ignoring. Need blind or need ignoring implies that the admissions committee makes a decision about whether or not to admit a student regardless of the student's financial need. So I like ignoring because it's impossible to be blind to a student's financial need or likely need when the first page of an application says where the student lives, what the school the student goes to, what the parents or guardians do for a living. It's pretty hard to not infer financial need from some of those circumstances, but need blind means that those circumstances are ignored and the student is assessed for admission purely based on his or her qualifications. Need sensitive or need aware is not blind or ignoring of that information and takes into account how much a student or family may need when they decide whether or not to admit the student. Meeting full demonstrated need means exactly what it says, that if a university calculates how much a student and family needs to be able to afford the full cost of study, then the financial aid award that they grant will equal that amount. Gapping, on the other hand, refers to a policy whereby the financial need can be determined at X or Y amount, but the financial aid that's offered will be less than that amount, resulting in a gap, a difference between how much is awarded and how much is needed, with the understanding that the family or the student somehow fills that gap themselves. And admit, deny, this is possibly a little strangely phrased, but this refers to admitting a student without offering financial aid, such that it's in some ways seen as a deny because the student has demonstrated financial need and cannot afford what it costs to enroll. Then yes, you've admitted that student, but they can't really come. So it's perceived by some as just a different way of denying a student. I don't like to think of it that way. I think it's presented, a good colleague of mine from Bryn Mawr College likes to say, some colleges will say, we won't invite you to dinner if you can't afford to eat, which means to say if your demonstrated need cannot be met by us with a financial aid package, we will not admit you because that would be unfair. Equally, other universities have the philosophy that we'll give you a chance to come and see if you can find a way to come up with the money, see if you can find a way to fund your studies in another way. And so they will offer admission even though they know they haven't met the demonstrated need with a financial aid package, and they'll see what the student can do. Moving on to the next slide, we want to talk a little bit more about some of these types of aid. As I mentioned, need blind or need ignoring, and meeting full demonstrated need. That is one type of university sort of approach. We see how much we see your qualifications, we ignore how much you need. We are going to admit you based on your qualifications. Then, having admitted you, we guarantee that we will give you a financial aid package that meets your demonstrated need. That's obviously wonderful, the holy grail. Need sensitive or need aware financial aid and meeting demonstrated need refers to an admissions committee saying, okay, we've looked at both your qualifications and how much financial aid you need. If we admit you, we will meet that full demonstrated need, but we're keeping in mind how much you do need, and that will impact our decision because budgets, because realities of post-2008, for example, economic circumstances. So aware of what you need, but we will meet it. The third option is we don't look at how much financial aid you need. We're going to admit you based on your qualifications, but we may not be able to meet your full demonstrated need in the financial aid package, which is also referred to as gapping. So you see on the right and left sides of our little stool there, the types of aid, and then other factors that the university is considering around their enrollment goals. If we can go to the next slide, we'll look at those goals in a little more detail. So It's useful sometimes to think of these types of goals as the legs of a stool. Without all four of these, the chair will not stand very well. Without all four of these categories, an admissions committee cannot perhaps make a fully engaged decision. So the typical enrollment goals for a university, obviously academic quality, qualification, the profile of the student. Obviously the first goal is that universities want to admit students who are suitably prepared to be academically successful. Because budgets, universities also must look at tuition revenue and think about how much money do they need to bring in, how much tuition income or revenue do they need to make the budgets balance. Diversity, an important factor, obviously. Diversity goals tend to focus on trying to have an incoming class in some way or another mirror the socioeconomic and geographic and racial diversity of a class of students, if, for example, in the United States, to mimic what you would see in a band of the population of the U.S. That's a lofty goal that's difficult to reach, but it's certainly something that universities look at and consider. And diversity, can refer to racial or ethnic diversity, but also socioeconomic, geographic, and other sub-diversities that some universities might prioritize. And then obviously, purely on a practical level, the number of students that the university can accommodate and how many that they will admit each year. Combined, these are the factors that will inform how many students and which students a university will enroll. Next slide, please. So the reality is, as an international student, meaning a foreign student who needs financial aid and an F1 visa, the numbers are a little scary. The reality is that only 18% of international students receive financial aid. That is both need and merit financial aid combined. So it is limited, but that's not to say that it isn't there and that students shouldn't compete for it. You'll see that the majority of financial aid available to international students is offered by private universities and nonprofit universities. The other types of universities, public, usually also referred to as state schools, have limited financial aid, usually for international students, having a mandate to serve the students of their state first. Public two-year universities, community colleges, again some but limited financial aid for international students. Private for-profit universities also very, on average, limited financial aid. So if you have high-need students, they're going to want to really focus on the private nonprofit universities where they will be most competitive. I believe we have one more slide. Thank you. So this is a super handy map from a super handy website. I don't usually, those of you who know me, give shout outs to the College Board, but I will praise their Big Future site. So it's bigfuture.collegeboard.org, which has a lot of really useful information about universities across the United States and elsewhere. You can see from this map that the great majority of financial aid available for international students is available at private four-year universities and is available largely in the east and northeast part of the United States, with a little bit in the center and then a bit in some more far-flung places. Certainly that concentration in New England and Mid-Atlantic states is something that you want to consider when you're advising students who might have regional preferences otherwise because family live there or California is on TV all the time, whatever they might hear. Finally, a little bit more on the sources of funding. As I said, with 18% available to international students or going to international students, the reality is that fully 2/3 of the financial aid that international students do bring to the table is from families and personal or other sources. So the reality in the United States is international students generally are paying for the cost of university. There is financial aid from colleges and universities. Some get bursaries from their governments or other organizations, and a few contribute from employment, but the reality is, while it's a large number, at $35.8 billion contributed to the U.S. economy by international students, a fairly small number really is paid out to them, so to speak, in international funding. But again, applying to the right places and in the right way with a strategy will lead to good results, and so students and families should not be discouraged by that. It's just, as counselors, it's useful to know sort of the context and the realities we're working within. I think I'm going to hand it over now.
All right. Thank you, Laura. So we'll talk a little bit, I'll go through these slides fairly quickly, just looking at the types of scholarships that are offered at universities. These can be both public or private institutions. Laura's touched on some of them, so we'll get through this fast. Merit-based scholarships, competitive or selective, you'll hear that term interchangeably. Athletic, talent, special populations, and need-based scholarships are the types that we're going to focus on tonight or this morning. Next slide. So merit-based scholarships, again, are self-explanatory somewhat. They are scholarships that are awarded based on some form of merit. Typically, merit-based scholarships are academically focused, and they're using some type of institutions using some type of threshold criteria that typically has to do with student academic quality, as gauged by SAT or ACT score and GPA. Decreasingly, you see rank as a factor that typically is not something that's being paid as much attention to in the admission process. Merit-based scholarships, if they follow a very public or forward-facing formula, are considered automatic. So that's kind of the distinction point. If a student is able to go directly to an admissions website at a university and look at the criteria, kind of an if-then formula in terms of scholarship award, then it is considered automatic. But merit-based scholarships can also be competitive, as we'll talk about on the next slide. So competitive or selective scholarships are typically involving some type of holistic review process. So in addition to admission, students are also oftentimes being asked to submit additional essays. There may be an interview. This is oftentimes where you might see alumni engaged in meeting with students internationally in particular. It's helpful, I think, to know as a counselor, though, that those competitive or selective scholarships are usually starting from an academic threshold foundation. So there is some form of if-then formula being applied to the scholarship before students are invited to compete for additional academic awards. It's not uncommon that those awards would be stackable. So a student may, at the point of admission or scholarship deadline, qualify for an automatic merit-based scholarship, then be invited to compete for an additional selective scholarship. Those scholarships may be university level, or they may be offered by the department, the academic department to which a student is applying. As a caveat, though, one thing at Indiana University and previously at University of Missouri, we were always very candid with international applicants, all applicants really, to let them know that departmental scholarships are not often awarded to freshmen. More often those happen as students progress toward or within their academic major. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And most of my colleagues on the university side of the desk, I think, do a really great job of describing that distinction for students. Next slide. Athletic scholarships we'll spend a little bit more time talking about because we get a lot of questions, and those of us on the university side of the desk are reading a lot of essays right now about sports. So shout out to the admissions folks on the call. Obviously, they will involve some form of verification of talent, and for most students, what comes into mind with them is some type of tryout with an athletic team. For students abroad, verification of sporting talent, though, is oftentimes a video portfolio, statistics, letters from coaches, things like that. It's less likely that a student would be scouted in person unless that student is looking at an NCAA Division I, possibly an NAIA Division I athletic team. One thing to keep in mind when counseling students is that athletic scholarships are not always full tuition. They're not always full tuition, room and board. There are very strict regulations within the within the athletic association for each respective university as to how those awards, those athletic awards, are distributed. So it can sometimes be a surprise to students that they are not offered a full scholarship or a full scholarship that includes tuition, room, board, things like that. Awards can be combined with merit scholarships, and so this is the two-pronged approach that you see on the slide, that when you're counseling with students, it's not at all uncommon that athletic scholarships will follow the academic or competitive scholarship funnel timeline. Coaches are typically very savvy about their student athletes, and so there's quite a bit of communication that happens between admissions offices at universities and athletic eligibility centers in particular on our campuses to see what type of academic awards or departmental scholarships students may be eligible for before the coach would award an athletic scholarship. And so all of this combines to form a very holistic financial aid package for a student athlete. The primary eligibility centers that we work with, you can see listed there. NCAA is the most known. Those tend to be larger universities. That's the National Collegiate Athletic Association. NAIA, the National Athletic Intercollegiate Association, tends to be at smaller private universities or smaller public universities. For international students in particular, I am always very promotional towards NAIA. I think a great distinction that we use when talking with students about NCAA is that in order for students to really be considered for athletic scholarship at an NCAA Division I school, they need to be competing at national level. And a statistic that we throw out at Indiana University that tends to get students' attention is that had Indiana University been its own state or its own nation at the Olympics, we would have placed 14th, I think, in terms of country medal counts. So helping students to get some type of context around those Division I schools can be very helpful, but then also making sure that they're aware of NAIA or NJCAA, the National Junior Collegiate Athletic Association, that do also offer full scholarships for students who want to continue in their athletic events, but are also not necessarily looking at an athletic career post-university. Each of these national eligibility centers are looking at GPA components for students to be able to play, and they also require amateur status. And it's, I think, very important for student athletes to be aware of the broken leg theory, meaning that international students, domestic students, regardless, that are receiving athletic scholarship, those athletic scholarships are awarded year to year. So if a student, for some reason, becomes unable to play, for example, because of a broken leg, during year 2 or year 3 of their studies, that athletic scholarship may not be renewed. So that's something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Talent scholarships, we've got musical notes here, but talent scholarships really are typically within the arts. So it could be music or performance studies. Those tend to be the most common, but they can vary. These are awarded to students obviously with special abilities and are hyper-competitive and typically require some type of portfolio or audition. Again, when working with international students, most universities at this point are able to utilize some type of technology to allow for remote auditioning. Most conservatory level performance programs, for example, Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University coordinates our audition series in the spring with, I think, about 14 other universities that are doing high-level conservatory, so that if students do plan to do a round of auditions, they can mitigate some of the travel expenses and time required to do that. Next slide. All right, and special populations are, these tend to be smaller awards, but every little bit helps, so it's something for students to be aware of. If you're working with a student who does have any type of family connection to an institution, it does not always necessarily have to be immediate family. Some institutions will offer alumni or heritage scholarships to extended family members, maybe aunts, uncles, things like that. So it's always worth a bit of digging for students to look into that. Some universities will also offer automatic regional scholarships. If you're a student applying from Thailand and an institution has a historical relationship with Thailand, they may offer a regional automatic scholarship or a competitive scholarship. So that's good to be aware of. Religious affiliations, particularly at smaller private universities, are not uncommon. Even universities that you may not, or colleges that you may not necessarily associate with a religious affiliation may have been founded within a religious discipline. In the Midwest, for example, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Disciples of Christ institutions are not uncommon. And oftentimes they may still retain some type of tuition discount or small scholarship for students who are active within that faith. And lastly, looking for partnerships, university partnerships, these international memoranda of understanding, they may extend to sister cities. There are some public universities who have arrangements with states within other countries or with whole countries to offer students from that nation in-state tuition. So that's always worth a little bit of research as well. Next slide, please. We'll transition here to need-based scholarships, and I'll let Jenny from St. Olaf talk with you about that.
Wonderful. I think I'm on, and I can't get my video, which is absolutely fine. So I'm just going to jump into need-based financial aid. I think as we talk about domestic or international need-based financial aid, ultimately the institution, if they are giving these scholarships, is going to want to make sure that the limited funding that the college has is distributed as fairly and equitably as possible. So to do that, the first point, we consider the EFC. That's a term we throw around a lot, and it means estimated family, or sometimes estimated financial contribution. And that's basically the amount that we have determined that the family is able to contribute towards their university education for their son or daughter. This is not necessarily what a family necessarily wants to pay or thinks that they can easily pay, but what has been determined based on that fair and equitable kind of philosophy of making sure that students are paying what they're able. So we take into account parent income, assets and savings, number in family, extenuating circumstances. This may be healthcare costs. Families may be taking care of extended family members. Things like that. That is taken into account. And cost of living, especially when we're looking at the international population and the difference among different countries. As Laura had said in a previous slide, need-based aid is primarily available at private universities and colleges, but there are certainly exceptions at public schools as well. It takes many forms. Oftentimes a need-based financial aid package will be need-based grants that a student does not have to pay back. Sometimes with students there's confusion between the terms grant and scholarship. Neither one has to be paid back to the college. As John's already talked about, merit and talent scholarships, if a student is getting a need-based financial aid package, oftentimes the merit scholarship may be part of the need-based financial aid, and usually not in addition to a full need-based financial aid package that a student is receiving. Financial aid package will often include work study and campus jobs. Sometimes it's important as you're working with students to clarify that the student visa does limit the amount of work that a student can do in the U.S. For the most part limited to on-campus employment, some exceptions to that, but for the most part on campus, and oftentimes limited for instance, at St. Olaf, it's about $2,300 a year that a student can earn on campus. So just for students to be realistic as to how much they can earn through work, study, or campus job. And then loans is sometimes a component of a need-based financial aid package. If a student is not a U.S. citizen, they cannot borrow loans in the U.S., but there are colleges that will provide optional loans directly from the institution, from the college, so that's something to consider. So now we're going to go to the next slide and talk about the application forms that a student may encounter as they're applying for need-based financial aid. Keep in mind that in addition to what's listed here, some schools may have their own institutional forms, so it might not be one of these two main applications that we're listing, but most common are the International Student Financial Aid application and the ISFA, and that is through the College Board. It's paper-based and oftentimes a great option for international students, and we'll actually take a look at both of these applications in future slides. The other option for a lot of schools is the CSS profile, College Scholarship Service Profile. This is actually not international specific. Any of you who are also working with U.S. citizens probably know that a lot of U.S. students in the U.S. and outside the U.S. may have to submit the CSS profile to the institutions they're applying to. A lot of times schools will use this as their institutional form. If we went deeper into the financial aid methodology, this is usually what an institution is using to determine their institutional methodology. Again, not international specific, but very international friendly in that a student is entering information in their home currency and the college is receiving the information in US dollars, and there's a country coefficient that is put into that, so that's very helpful. Other forms that students will see through the process, the Certification of Finances form. This is going to be required at some point in the process for all students who are applying for their visa. It's basically what colleges and universities require to verify that the necessary funding is there to make sure that they're covering the full cost of attendance. So some schools will require this at the time of application with everything else and with the application for financial aid. And other times colleges and universities will maybe wait until the student has been admitted and decides to enroll before requesting this form with all of the accompanying documentation. For instance, I usually require it, I always require it if a student's not applying for financial aid to verify that that funding is there without any support from us. But if a student is applying for financial aid, need-based financial aid, especially with significant need, I usually waive the certification of finance form during the application process and then tell the student that that's something that's going to be required down the road. The FAFSA form, free application for federal student aid. This is federal is in the title, so this is what is necessary for U.S. students who are applying for need-based financial aid, and that's federal aid. So usually you're not going to see that as you're working with non-U.S. citizens or international students, but sometimes that is a question. Supporting documentation. Usually this is required along with the certification of finance form whenever that's required in the process. So tax forms, current bank and savings statements, income information, wherever the source of funding is, the school's probably going to require something to verify that information. And know, as you're working with students and families, that colleges and universities are going to be very mindful for the most part that some documentation is easier to get in certain countries than other, and a lot of us can be pretty flexible depending on what's available. So the school uses all this information to verify the funding, and then that's what we use to create the I-20 and eventually send that to the student to take to their visa interview. And so a good reminder as you're working with students is to make sure that they're saving all of this information or copies of all of this documentation to actually take with them to their visa interview to present to the visa official, because that's going to be important to document all of that. Again, go on to the next slide. And now we're just looking at the actual application form, so you have an idea of what that looks like if you haven't seen it before. So this is found on the College Board site and also linked from actual college and university websites, so pretty easy to find. Again, lack of documentation, we realize that some students can't access some documents that may be requested with this application, and we can be flexible there. Tax documentation, bank statements. Basically, this form is asking for parent and guardian information. Again, we're looking at income, assets, family members in school that the parents are supporting in addition to the student applying, and then expenses. In addition to that, there is a section for expected support. I think a good note around that area is really encourage students, and I think this is mentioned in a later slide as well, to really be as accurate as possible about what they believe they can contribute towards their college or university expenses. If they over or underestimate that amount too drastically, they may be under-awarded financial aid and then not be able to make it possible in the end, or if they're suggesting that they can't pay as much as they can, then that might limit their opportunities to get admitted, as Laura had talked about earlier, as schools look at that and what they can provide for students. So we'll go on to the next slide, the CSS profile. So there's oftentimes concern about the CSS profile if a student sees that this is required, because there is a fee for this, and I know people have mixed feelings that there's a charge to apply for need-based financial aid. It is $25, additional reports are $16. We realize that some countries don't have great access to use their credit cards, but keep in mind that some universities will provide fee codes, and then the university is actually we're paying that cost on behalf of the student. Some organizations can buy fee codes as well and distribute those towards students. And again, keep in mind that it's never a bad question to ask if schools would allow the paper form, and the best example of that is what we just talked about, the International Student Financial Aid application, because that is a free form for students, so don't hesitate to ask if there's alternatives to the CSS profile if that is a concern. So we'll go on to the next slide, and this just really briefly is going to show how colleges and universities, in a very general sense, may calculate the cost and the financial aid package. So basically, at the most basic level, the formula is the cost of attendance, which we're usually taking into account room, board, tuition, books, health insurance, and personal expenses. And that's the cost of attendance that actually has to be put on the I-20 that we talked about before, that a student is using to apply for their visa. So it's usually more than the cost of tuition, room, and board, but a few slides from now we're going to talk about some additional expenses that actually usually aren't in this cost of attendance figure. So we look at that estimated family contribution that we've determined either through the International Student Financial Aid application or the CSS profile, and then we come up with the need or the eligibility for aid. I think we can go on to the next slide. And this is pretty, we talked about this pretty quickly. As students are comparing different schools of different costs, this is just meant to show that the estimated family contribution is going to be the same regardless of the cost of attendance, but their need will differ. And this might go without saying. But as Laura had talked about, as some schools meet all or most of need, then the family may be paying the same amount between college A and college B. However, if a school is going to gap the financial aid package, that's where a student might end up paying more at the more expensive college, or that college that's more expensive, funding that student with an EFC of $20,000 may take more institutional funding, and then that student might be more expensive, and because of that, admission could be more competitive if it's a need-sensitive philosophy, as Laura had discussed before. So that is all we have on need-based financial aid. We're going to turn it over to Tracy to talk about some resources for counselors.
Thanks, Jenny. Indeed, we've gone through a lot of information, and there really is a lot out there on financial aid, but it doesn't seem to all be in one place. Often it's challenging to sift through everything that's out there, and this is something that we recognize as a need on the IAS committee, and we've put together a resource website on the International IACAC website. You can see in the screen grab there that there's a resources tab. It's under there under web resources, financial aid. And what we've tried to do is compile some of the resources that have floated around, on the Facebook page, or that we used in our own offices, that friends shared with us, and try to stick it all in one place. It includes documents, PDFs that have been out there, created by organizations as well as individuals. It also includes important websites, including the College Board website that Laura showed to you earlier with the map showing the different aid awarded to international students. So this includes information for U.S. citizens as well as international students, DACA students. So we try to be as inclusive as possible. Anything related to financial aid that could benefit the members of IACAC we wanted to try to include. So we do have a variety of different things. There are some charts on there that look at which schools include merit-based or need-based for students. There's a great list by Jenny Kent and Jeff Levy, the College Board site. There's an in-state tuition for international students Excel form. So there's a lot of things on there, and we encourage you, as you're trying to wrap your head around some of this information, to check out what's there and see if it can guide you in your process with working with families and students. Next slide, please. So we do want to take a moment to touch on external scholarships. You will notice that we've spent the bulk of our time talking about institutional aid, whether that be athletic or merit or talent or need-based aid, because that's really where the bulk of the money that international students will probably receive. It's often renewable. External scholarships are pretty limited. They usually focus on U.S. citizens. They typically are one-time awards. They may be small amounts that kind of are one-time given. They are often very highly competitive too, involving a lot of work on the students end, recommendations, interviews, just a great deal of additional work the students are doing on top of their college application process. So while many parents seem to think that there is some sort of magic all-covering 4 years sort of external scholarship, we try to work with our families and help them understand that that's not really what's out there for most students. Next slide, please. So we have compiled a few scholarships here just to highlight some of the things that may be out there, but to also highlight that there are limitations. For example, the BMI Student Composer Award is obviously for student musicians. It's $5,000, but limited to citizens of the Western Hemisphere. The Microsoft Scholarship is a full tuition scholarship, but limited in discipline, as it has to be related to math or the sciences or engineering. The ROW is a loan that is offered only to Latin American students up to $15,000. MasterCard offers some great awards, but it's limited geographically and to students with significant need. So while these may be opportunities for students, and we certainly encourage students to look into the opportunities available for external scholarships, we certainly would never want a family or a student to base their whole financial plan on pursuing external scholarships. Thank you. Just one more note before I pass it on to Laura again. If there is a resource that you're looking for, or one that you're using that you're interested in sharing with us to put onto the resource page, there is an email at the bottom of the page where you can share your ideas as well as resources. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. Thank you, Laura. I'll let you move on.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to carry on with a little bit of additional context for costs for international students. Again, students who are not U.S. citizens who are applying for, students who are applying for an F1 student visa using that all-powerful I-20 document that Jenny referred to. So again, excuse me, throwing my pens around, quickly to reiterate the costs that are demonstrated on an I-20, which is the document that the student takes to apply for a visa, shows a list of costs and a total amount, and the student's family has to demonstrate that they can pay that total amount through bank statements or other income statements, whatever documents they may provide. So traditionally the stuff that's on the I-20 is the tuition and fees. That usually includes books, living expenses, health insurance is on top of that, required by, I believe, by all colleges and universities in the United States, and some other expenses, and they may list expenses for dependents if that's relevant. There's an other category because there's always another. Funds from private sponsors, etc., but they have to demonstrate that total. So it's important to know that there are other quote-unquote unseen or invisible costs for international students. And this can be very important to stress to students from really low-income families who are going to have challenges meeting these funds, so that even a student who wins that full scholarship that covers the total I-20 cost, there are additional expenses including passport fees, the student visa application fees, of which there are 2 or 3 different fees, the application fee itself, non-refundable, the SEVIS fee. Some countries have a reciprocity fee, which is just a fun extra fee because their country and our country don't get along. Standardized testing fees, of course. It's always worthwhile to ask if a test can be waived. If the cost of taking that test is going to be a burden, it never hurts to ask. And that applies to the ACT, SAT, and even the TOEFL. It's important to note that while the College Board does give domestic U.S. citizens test fee waivers, it does not extend that to international students. I don't know why. Equally, while the CSS profile has fee waivers available for domestic students, it does not offer those fee waivers to international students. And unfortunately, your international students can miss those fine print asterisks. So it's important for you to know that those fees not necessarily can be waived for internationals. And so when confirming any of these policies, SAT waivers or CSS profile waivers, anything like that, it's really important to read the fine print and confirm that the policy that you're reading applies to international F1 seeking students and not domestics. That goes for anything that you see published on the International ACAC website or the college university's own website. Anywhere it's important to read that you're really making sure you're getting information for your internationals. Vaccinations is another expense. Those can run $200–300. Rebecca had subbed in there that currently it costs $290 for a student to get all the required vaccinations to go to the U.S. in Zimbabwe. So you can estimate $200–300 probably. And an important one that students unfortunately rarely realize is that once they are in university in the United States, part of their financial aid is considered taxable income by our friends in the U.S. government and the IRS. And so obviously the more scholarship you earn, the more tax you are liable for, and we won't go into the politics of that thinking. A student who is receiving a full scholarship can anticipate owing taxes of $1,000 to $1,200 to even $1,500 per year. They have to file those taxes. They often can get some, most, or I've heard even of all of it as a reimbursement, as a refund, just like U.S. citizens can get, but they have to go through the process of filing and paying and then getting that refund. So that's an important thing for students and families to understand and be aware of. Obviously that occurs after they're in university. The next slide, please. Just some sort of keys to success and things to think about in this whole process. So we've given you a lot of information, and some of it is relevant to some students more than others in terms of how much students need, how much families need. If students need a full ride, soup to nuts, as they say in New England, then that student has a different reality than the student from a family who can pay $10,000 or $20,000 a year and needs the difference covered. So it's important to let students and families know that you're going to discuss this information with them privately and confidentially, that this won't be public knowledge. You're not going to shout out in assembly all the kids who are applying for financial aid. And it's even more important to stress, as Jenny mentioned, that these conversations have to be honest and transparent. It's critical, and many of us work in parts of the world where the cultures and traditions and mores are very different around money, place to place, between the US and there, whatever your home culture is in that place. So these can be sort of difficult but crucial conversations to really have parents and families and students understand they have to be honest in this process in order to end up with the financial aid package that actually will meet their needs. Equally, universities really rely on the high school counselors to help them with this process and to help communicate through and with the families. And so it's important as counselors that you are seen by the universities as transparent and demonstrating integrity through this process. So, you know, there's sort of checks and balances almost. So it's important for your reputation as a counselor to be representing to the students and equally to the universities as fair and accurate a set of information as you can. You can be the most powerful advocate for your students when universities understand and believe that you are sharing the best information that you have available and that you're making sure everything is above board as far as you know. And the last slide, please. So some things to be mindful in this process, in this process. Again, it's important to sort of lay everything out on the table and to develop a realistic plan with students and families being informed of how everything works, how we'll go through the process together, and understanding the impacts and the implications of applying for financial aid. It's important that families and students understand that it is their responsibility to pay for university. There is, you know, sometimes a thinking of, oh, like, oh, my kid's a good kid. He has good grades. She does really well. Obviously, she should get a full scholarship, and that's sure. She definitely should. Doesn't mean she's going to, and so families really need to understand that this is a process they have to undertake with in earnest, let's say. We want to emphasize there tends to be this marrying in people's heads of a school being need blind and meeting 100% of a student's need, and that is not necessarily the case. So again, it's important to look at universities' policies on their websites and talk to the admissions officers and understand how an awareness of a student's financial need may impact the admissions and the committee's decisions in each individual place as much as possible. And I think this is really important. Never apply to a college or a university that doesn't fit the students and the family's needs. I tell my students that's like, you know, schlepping all the way to the capital city to buy a really expensive pair of sneakers that don't fit. It's just a waste of your time and your money, and you're going to come home with no good sneakers. So it's really worth applying to identifying the right schools, the right fit in financially and otherwise, and applying to those schools and not, you know, places that are obviously, according to the policies, not going to work out. Financial aid awards are renewable each year. They do not necessarily increase with the raise. There's usually an annual small but not insignificant increase in tuition and fees costs each year at universities. Financial aid packages don't necessarily adjust each year to jive with those policies, but they are, or price increases, but they are evaluated each year. And so that gives students the opportunity to sort of engage and negotiate in that process if it's necessary. And as the last bullet indicates, that's an annual process, but if something unforeseen and dramatic happens in the student or family's circumstances, they can be, at times, it's obviously very case by case, but they can be adjusted sort of midstream if that's necessary. So students should understand that they should feel that they can go to the counselors or the admissions and financial aid officers in their school and ask for or about that process if it's needed. They shouldn't just struggle through without asking for help. We've gone on quite a ways here. I think we're ready to go to the last slide, which just says, any questions? And I know we've talked for a while, but we're happy to address what we can. And I think I speak for everyone and I say, obviously, this conversation can continue offline, and we're available for other possibly case-by-case questions as needed.
Sure, and I was actually following some of the questions that were asked in the little box, and so I'll go through and prioritize some of the ones that were asked. One of the questions was, is it appropriate to ask an admissions officer about a given situation and ask for advice on behalf of a student? So I think this came up during Laura's slide, so if you want to go ahead and maybe address that, Laura.
Well, I'm not an admissions officer anymore. I was once upon a time, but I would probably also ask Jenny or John to contribute their thoughts. From my side, for better or for worse, I always ask. It never hurts to ask, I figure. You know, politely and within the bounds of confidentiality and integrity, I always want to know, hey, how will this go? But I'll let admissions folks who actually have to receive those questions comment.
Yeah, I think absolutely. As Laura said, we want to make sure that students are finding that right fit, and if it won't be the right financial fit, perhaps using their time and energy and money to apply to schools that will be a better financial fit. So having that conversation on the front end, whether it's through the college counselor or the student or family themselves, I think is absolutely welcomed.
Laura, similar to what you said earlier, we always advise students it's free to ask throughout the whole process. If there's anything at all that they're unclear of, both counselors and admissions officers, I think, are really good about diplomatically establishing boundaries and parameters for those conversations. But students should be able to feel within the boundaries of respect very comfortable posing questions.
One of the other questions I got was, is there a way to calculate the expected family contribution, and where can a counselor or a student find that information? So I'll let someone take it away. Jenny, you look like you want to say something.
Well, in the earlier session, I had mentioned that most, I think all now, colleges and universities in the U.S. have to have a net price calculator on their institutional website. And a point I had made in the last session was that that does not always apply to international students, or it's not as valuable as it might be for a U.S. citizen. So it's not as easy, I don't think, for an international student to determine that EFC before they actually submit one of those applications or whatever the college is requesting. But again, I think that conversation can be had at any point in the process. If they're not even sure that they should be submitting the financial aid application, that's a conversation I think to have with the admissions or financial aid office at that school.
Another question, thanks for that answer, Jenny. I guess I'm going to send this John's way. It was in regards to if a student wants to go to a school and play in a Division 1, 2, or 3. I guess this question is, how would they demonstrate their athletic ability? What should they do? Was that question that was there?
Sure. Coaches are typically very stats-driven as kind of the first verification level. So they'll want to know what type of events, what type of venues the student has played in. Are they national level, state level, regional? And then they'll want to know statistics, performance statistics specific to that athletic event. Beyond that, then they like to see some type of recording, or less likely a live demonstration of the student's ability on the field or court or in the pool, what have you. One of the pieces of advice that we typically give to student athletes is fairly early in certainly their secondary school career to start to develop an online portfolio. We see a lot of students using WordPress blogs where they can post video clips of performances, update stats in real time. I think that can be very helpful. And then letters from coaches. That's usually enough to get the attention of an athletic coordinator.
Awesome. We don't have a lot of time to go through all of the questions, but I will say everyone in this session does have their information on the directory. But I will take a couple more questions. One of them is from Tuan. Is there a list of schools offering need-sensitive scholarships? does anyone know where a counselor or student might be able to find this? Tracy, you're smiling, so maybe you.
We're looking for that magic silver bullet list that has all this stuff for international students, and as of yet it doesn't exist, but maybe someone out there today is the one who's going to make it. There is, I mentioned earlier, the College Board, we had the screen grab that Laura went over, as well as Jenny Kent and Jeff Levy's list. Both will show schools that, what their aid policy is, if it's need or merit. And also how many international students are receiving aid and how many international students are there. So you can kind of see who's getting what. It would be wonderful if we could find a list somewhere that shows which institutions are need blind, need sensitive, need aware, no need, all in one place. But as of yet, we haven't found anything that's specifically geared for international students. Most sources that are out there are U.S. centric, which obviously is helpful for any students living abroad with U.S. passports, but doesn't help the majority of the international population.
Sam?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've got a partial message that has come through from one of the participants, and so I apologize it's wonky, but it's a good question asking about how state schools offer financial aid to international students, given that state schools are funded by taxpayers, really kind of getting at the play there. This is a great question, and politically it's something that public universities deal with quite often. However, there's good data provided by American Council of Education, ACE, and by College Board and a couple of other independent firms that show the expectations for SAT and ACT test takers who are college bound clearly indicate that they expect to have international engagement on U.S. campuses as part of their university experience. So Hart and Associates, I know, and College Board and ACE have done some good research on that. From a public university standpoint, we also know that when we're assessing outcomes for our graduates, employers want to see that global engagement as well as an outcome of learning. And so from the public perspective, we view global engagement, international communities of learning, international experiences as meeting that access mandate for public education. And the other point that I would make is that typically the funding models in place with public universities are such that international students oftentimes are subsidizing their own scholarships. So there's some form of tuition recapture that's happening that then subsequently funds perhaps, we can't really, at least at Indiana University and most publics, call it need-based scholarships, but we can redirect scholarships regionally to students that we anticipate would have greater need than others. So it's kind of a self-funding model for most international scholarships. So great question. Appreciate it.
I'm going to ask this one last question before we end, and it's coming from Zoe Williams. How much involvement are you expecting a counselor to have had in a student's financial forms? Maybe the parents don't speak English as well as we would need them to. So what would you say would be the role of a guidance counselor or high school counselor in that?
Jenny, I think that'd be a great question. Yeah. There was the bus, Jenny.
I can comment too from the counselor side when you're done, Jenny.
I'm just going to listen to you because I want to know the answer too.
I think Laura had mentioned this in the presentation, that I think we trust the best relationships that we have with counselors are counselors who are transparent and honest, and that we sense are working with the families and students as much as they're able. As far as actually assisting in the actual form, like the question suggests, I think it depends on what the family needs and how active the family is in the process. But I would absolutely trust the college counselors who are involved in this conversation to provide, the right advice and ethical conversations around that. So I think that's a fine thing.
And I think from the high school side, it ranges very widely, I'm sure. I think at a lot of sort of standard international schools, counselors can expect to have fairly little, if any, involvement in the financial aid forms, because that's a thing that the family does. And you know, as I mentioned, cultures range widely on this, but often financial information is kept very private. It can put the counselor in a little bit of a funny position because they could find out after the fact that so-and-so applied for financial aid while they drove around in their gold Maserati, and these are, you know, things that you know, they address in a case-by-case scenario. But honestly, university admissions and financial aid committees are savvy enough to be able to sort of sort through those, you know, glaring differences in reality 1 and reality 2. I think with low-income students, I think a counselor can be expected to be possibly very involved, because the likelihood is that the family and the students don't have any sort of savvy or background or experience with these types of forms. And they are, as much as they're marked to be for international students, they tend to be very sort of U.S. or West-centric, and to use terms, phrases, requirements that don't really resonate in a lot of cultures and don't make a lot of sense in a lot of other places. And so counselors can be very helpful and necessary in the process. So I would say that on average it's useful to equip yourself with the knowledge of how the forms work and what they require and how folks should fill them out. Maybe even, you know, prepare some samples so that you don't have to get involved, but you send students home with a this is what it should look like, this is what they're asking in these funny questions. That can be really helpful, because if a student, for lack of knowledge, fills out the forms incorrectly, that can really impact whether or not they end up getting admitted and funded.
So I think that's actually all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to my panelists. Thank you to all of the attendees who are here. Again, don't forget to look at our next webinar Wednesday, which will be coming next month. So thank you again, and have a great evening or morning wherever you are in the world. So thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.